In 1221, a Mongol army stood over a ruined Persian city and built 3 pyramids out of human skulls, one for the men, one for the women, one for the children. 40 years later, a merchant could cross that same ground from the edge of Europe to the coast of China carrying gold, and sleep soundly every night of the road. The same empire did both. This is about the arithmetic that connects them. Here is the picture almost everyone carries. A dust cloud on the skyline. Then the shape of it resolves into horsemen, thousands of them, tens of thousands, moving with a discipline that feels wrong for something so wild. They take the granaries. They take the silver. They take the women and the artisans and leave the rest under a sky full of smoke. Then they turn their horses around and vanish back into a grassland no army can follow them into. A storm with stirrups. A people who produced nothing and simply took, until there was nothing left to take. It's a good story. It has the great virtue of being partly true. The Mongols under Genghis Khan really did move faster, hit harder, and kill on a scale that the settled kingdoms of the 13th century had no vocabulary for. The terror was not a rumor, it was policy. But notice what the story quietly assumes. It assumes that taking is the whole business, that a conqueror is just a thief with a bigger horse. And if that were the whole business, the Mongol Empire should read like every raiding people before it. A bright, violent flash, a mountain of loot, and then a fading, as the loot ran out, and the horses grew fat. That is not what happened. And the reason it didn't is the most interesting thing about them, and the part the Storm on the Horizon version can't explain. So let me offer you a different lens, and hold it up for the next half hour. Stop looking at the Mongols as an army. Look at them as a business, one that stumbled, in blood, onto a problem every state eventually has to solve. Not how do we take. Every predator can take. The real problem is colder than that. Once you've taken everything, what do you do tomorrow? Because there are only 2 ways to get rich off other people's work, and they are not equal. You can take it all at once, everything they have, everything they've saved, and walk away wealthy. Or you can take a little and leave them alive and working, and come back for a little more, and keep coming back for 100 years. The first is plunder. The second is a tax. Plunder is the higher number. It is also, and this is the whole point, a number you can only collect once. A city you have burned does not pay you again next spring. A farmer you have killed grows nothing. The loot is real, and the loot is final. A tax is the smaller number that never stops. Plunder pays once. Safety pays forever. Hold on to that sentence. Everything else in this story is a consequence of a nomadic empire slowly, unevenly, and at appalling human cost coming to understand it. And I want to be careful here, because the neat version of this, the barbarians discovered good government, is a lie of sequence. They did not soften. They did not learn mercy. They ran the numbers. What follows is not a redemption, it's an accounting. To feel why that shift matters, you have to feel the cost of the first model. Not read it, feel it. Picture a city on the trade roads of Khwarizm, in what is now Turkmenistan and eastern Iran, in the year 1221. It has walls, workshops, irrigation channels dug and cleaned over 300 years. A market that has run continuously for longer than most European kingdoms have existed. It surrenders. And the army destroys it anyway, methodically, over days, dividing the population among the soldiers to be killed so that the count would come out right. This is the part where I have to stop performing analysis, because the subject won't allow it. At Nishapur, and again at Merv, the killing was not a battle, it was a program. The chroniclers who survived Persian writers with every reason to hate the men who did it put the dead at over 1 million in a single city. Modern historians look at those numbers and push back hard. And they're right to. The figures are almost certainly inflated. By factors of 5 or 10, by grief and propaganda, and the medieval habit of using 1 million to mean more than I can bear to count. The honest range is lower, perhaps 100 to 200,000 at Nishapur. But notice what that correction does and does not do. It shrinks the number, it does not clean it. 200,000 people is still a city erased. The skull pyramids, sorted by age and sex, are attested across too many independent sources to wave away. I'm not going to hand you a clever line here. This is the ground the rest of the story is built on, and it stays exactly this heavy. Because here is the thing that the administrative history books tend to launder, and I won't. The tax system, the roads, the passports, the famous Mongol order did not replace the massacres. It grew out of them. The safety they would later sell to merchants was credible for one reason and one reason only. Everyone had seen what the alternative looked like. The terror wasn't a phase the empire outgrew before it got organized. The terror was the collateral. Keep that in view. It does not go away just because the numbers that follow are about ledgers instead of skulls. Now, the arithmetic. An army that has just annihilated a city is standing in the most expensive silence in the world. The workshops are quiet. The fields the next season will not be planted. The men who knew how to clean the irrigation channels are dead, and the channels are already silting up. The Mongols were the first to feel this fully, because they had done it at a scale no one else had reached, and because, being pastoralists, they had a merciless clarity about one thing settled empires often forget: where wealth actually comes from. It comes from the herd, not the slaughter of the herd, the keeping of it. You do not eat your breeding stock in a hard winter, no matter how hungry you are, because the animal you eat today is every animal it would have birthed for the next 10 years. A stepchild learns this before they can ride. And somewhere in the 13th century, the men running the largest land empire in human history began to apply the logic of the herd to entire civilizations. And we can actually watch the moment the argument was had, because it survives in the records. In the early 1230s, with northern China freshly conquered and its farmland lying open, a faction at Ögedei Khan's court proposed the simplest possible use for it: kill off the Han peasants who remained and turn the whole of the north into grazing land, pasture for horses. It was, in its way, the purest expression of the old model: the land is loot, valued only for what it could be stripped down into. One man argued him out of it. His name was Yelu Chukai, a scholar from the Khitan people who served the court as an administrator. And he did not appeal to mercy, because mercy was not the currency in that room. He appealed to the ledger. Leave the farmers alive and taxed, he argued, and the settled north would yield something on the order of 500,000 ounces of silver, tens of thousands of bolts of silk, and hundreds of thousands of measures of grain every single year. Grazing land yields none of that. A dead province is worth one season of pasture. A living one funds your armies indefinitely. Ögedei listened and set up tax bureaus across the 10 routes of the north, with Yelu Chukai in charge of collecting exactly the revenue he had promised. And there it is, the whole thesis of this video, compressed into a single decision at a single court. The choice between the herd eaten and the herd kept, made out loud and settled by arithmetic. Not by conscience. By the size of the number? Leave the farmer in the field, leave the weaver at the loom, leave the caravan on the road, then count them, and take a fixed share, every year, forever. So they counted. This is the part that should genuinely surprise you. An empire of horsemen building the paperwork of a modern state. Across their territories, agents conducted a census, and repeated it roughly every 3 years, tallying households and livestock the way a herdsman tallies a flock. And onto that count, they laid a tax that was, by the standards of the age, radical in its dullness. A fixed, predictable levy. In Mongol-ruled Persia, the head tax eventually settled at a set rate per adult. The point was never the size of it. The point was that it was fixed. It did not spike when a governor felt greedy. Unauthorized plundering of tax-paying subjects was, remarkably, forbidden not out of tenderness, but because a soldier robbing a farmer was stealing from the Khan's future revenue. Read that again. The empire that made skull pyramids also made it a punishable offense to rob the wrong peasant. Both facts are true. They are the same policy seen from two ends of the same decade. The transformation was from a windfall to an annuity, and an annuity, held long enough, dwarfs any windfall. A city sacked gives you its treasury. A city taxed gives you its treasury again smaller, but next year and the year after, and for as long as you can keep it safe. And the Mongols held it long enough for the difference to show. A generation into the tax system, the settled provinces were handing over more wealth, more reliably, than any single sack had ever produced. Not in one spectacular haul that emptied a treasury, but in a steady current that refilled every year from the same source. The loot from even the richest city was a lump you spent down. The tax from a living province was a spring you kept returning to. Any conqueror can find a treasure. The rarer, harder trick, the one that actually paid the standing armies of the largest contiguous empire in history, was learning to want the spring more than the lump. Which raises the whole problem the rest of the empire was built to solve. Safe from what? Safe from whom? Including, awkwardly, from you. Here is where the institutions come in, and institutions are the tell. When you see a society building elaborate, expensive machinery to guarantee something, it is almost always because that something could not be taken for granted. The Mongols built three great machines, and each one is a substitute for a thing the 13th century world simply did not have across a continent: the assurance that a stranger with authority would be obeyed, and would not simply rob you himself. The first machine was the yam, the relay. Stations set along the roads at intervals of a long day's ride, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and a bed. A rider carrying the Khan's business could arrive exhausted, hand off, take a fresh mount, and go, and the next station would do the same, and the next. By the end of the century, a Venetian named Marco Polo, who worked inside this administration, described a web of thousands of these stations and a standing herd of post horses in the hundreds of thousands spread across the whole of Asia. Strip the number down for a traveler's exaggeration if you like the shape survives any discount. It meant a message, or a man, could cross the largest landmass on Earth at a speed that would not be matched again for 600 years. The continent had been wired. But someone paid for all those fresh horses, and it wasn't the Khan. The relay ran on requisition. The communities along each route were obliged to supply the stations with mounts, fodder, food, and lodging for anyone who arrived bearing the right authority. In principle, it was orderly. In practice, a steady stream of officials, envoys, and well-connected merchants leaned on the system, demanding more than their due, and the villages nearest the great roads could be quietly bled by the very network that made those roads worth traveling. The wiring of the continent was strung, pole by pole, on the backs of the people who happened to live beside it. It was a marvel. It was also a bill, and someone downhill always paid it. The second machine fit in your hand. It was called the paisa, a flat tablet of gold or silver or iron worn on a cord that told anyone who saw it exactly who you were and what would happen to them if they interfered. One that survives, inscribed in the Empire's script, carries a line that tells you everything about how this safety was enforced. It says, more or less, "I am the emissary of the Khan. If you defy me, you die." That is the paisa. It is a safe conduct pass and a death threat stamped on the same piece of metal, and the two things are not in tension. The safety was the threat. A merchant holding the right tablet was untouchable, not because the road had become gentle, but because everyone on it had calculated, correctly, the cost of touching him. The third machine was money moving. The Empire ran a system of partnerships, called the order and this is the one that should make a modern reader sit up. The state, and the Mongol nobility, would hand capital gold and silver ingots to merchant syndicates and send them out to trade. It offered them low-interest loans. It let them sleep in the relay stations. Under Kublai Khan, it went so far as to set up an office, in 1268, whose entire job was to supervise and finance these merchant partnerships. Pause on what that is. It is a state deliberately underwriting private long-distance trade, pooling the risk of a caravan the way you'd pool the risk of anything that might not come back. The Mongols had, in effect, become the venture capital of the Silk Road, absorbing the losses that used to sink individual merchants and taking a share of the wins. And I don't want to leave that machine looking cleaner than it was, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. The same partnerships that financed caravans also lent money, and not only to one another. They lent to the populations under Mongol rule, at interest that could compound viciously, and the debts owed to these state-backed syndicates became, in places, a real burden on the very taxpayers the empire was supposedly keeping safe. The line between financing trade and squeezing subjects was thin, and the order stood on both sides of it. The purpose of the machine was never fairness. It was flow-moving capital across distances that trust alone could never have reached, and the people it moved through did not always come out ahead. Three machines: speed, protection, and capital. And every one of them exists to manufacture a single product that the settled world had never been able to sell at scale. So let's name the product. And to do that, I have to show you the invisible line item, the one that never appears in the romantic version of the Silk Road, because it was never a thing you could see in a caravan. When you imagine long-distance trade before the Mongols, you probably imagine the goods. Silk, obviously. Spices, porcelain, silver, glass. And you imagine the danger as a kind of adventure, bandits, deserts, mountain passes. Here is the thing that changes the whole picture once you see it. For the merchant, that danger was not an adventure. It was a cost. The single largest cost of the entire enterprise. And it was almost never the goods. Think about what a caravan actually paid for. It paid for armed escorts. It paid a gift, a bribe, a toll, call it what you like, to every local strongman whose stretch of road it crossed. And there were dozens of them, each one a small sovereign of 40 miles of dust. It paid, statistically, for the caravans that did not arrive at all the losses baked in advance into the price of everything. The way an insurer prices a fire, it knows will happen somewhere. Protection was the product being sold on that road, over and over, by 100 different men, none of whom could guarantee it past the next ridgeline. It's the same logic as any risk you carry. A danger you can't remove is just a cost you pay in advance, whether you call it a guard, a bribe, or a loss. Now collapse all of that into a single authority. One power, one tariff, one tablet that works from the Black Sea to Beijing. Suddenly, the merchant is not negotiating with 40 warlords. He is paying one tax to one empire, and that empire has a monopoly on the violence along the whole route, which means it has both the ability and the self-interest to keep the road quiet, because every bandit is now stealing from the Khan. The unification, as one description of the period puts it, simply erased the crowd of competing tribute gatherers. The toll booths didn't get friendlier. They got demolished, all of them but one. Put yourself in the merchant's shoes on the old road. Before any of this, every border you crossed was a renegotiation, a new lord, a new demand, a fresh judgment call about whether the men blocking the pass were officials or bandits, and whether the difference even mattered to your cargo. You could not plan. You could not price. You carried enough silver to buy your way through trouble you couldn't foresee, which meant you carried enough silver to make yourself worth robbing. Every solution to the danger was also a new source of it. Now hand that same merchant a single tablet that means the same thing in every valley from Persia to the Pacific. The renegotiations stop. The route becomes a known quantity, something you can budget for, insure against, build a life's business around. That predictability, more than any single lowered fee, is the thing being sold. Certainty is what he was really starving for. And here is the payoff, the thing that makes this more than a story about administration. The great flourishing of Eurasian trade under the Mongols, the reason this century glows in the history of the Silk Road, did not happen because someone invented a new good, or a new route, or a new ship. Nobody discovered a faster camel. What changed was the price of risk. Protection got cheap. And when the cost of not being robbed falls far enough, trade that was never worth the danger before suddenly pencils out and it comes flooding across a continent that was always physically there, just too expensive to cross. And it wasn't only goods that moved. Once the road was cheap to travel, the most valuable cargo turned out to be the weightless kind. Persian astronomers turned up at the Chinese court. Chinese methods in medicine and printing drifted west. A Moroccan named Ibn Battuta and a Venetian named Marco Polo could, in the same century, simply go, cross the known world, come home, and be believed. Recipes, blueprints, banking techniques, the very idea of paper money, all of it rode the same lowered risk corridor as the silk. When you make a continent cheap to cross, you are not merely moving more of what already sold. You are letting ideas find each other that never could before. That is the second, quieter dividend of cheap safety. And it is easy to miss precisely because it never shows up on a cargo manifest. That is the product, not silk, safety. The Mongols were selling the one thing every merchant on Earth was already paying a fortune for, and they were selling it wholesale. Which brings us back to the horsemen on the horizon. Remember the accusation from the beginning, the savage, the robber, the storm with stirrups, the people who only knew how to take. I want to run each piece of it back through the lens we've been holding, because they don't survive the trip. The terror, the massacres, the skull pyramids we're taught to read as barbarism, as cruelty without purpose. But look at it through the ledger, and it becomes something colder and more deliberate. The advertising cost of a protection business. The safety sold to a merchant in 1260 was only worth paying for because everyone remembered 1221. The horror and the order were never opposites. The horror was the thing that made the order credible. The famous Mongol religious tolerance, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, all left to their gods we praise as enlightenment. It's cheaper than that, and more interesting. A tax collector does not care what a taxpayer prays to. Persecution is expensive. It kills workers and starts revolts and lowers next year's revenue. Tolerance was the efficient policy for a state whose income depended on leaving productive people productive. You can see how deliberate it was in a scene from the 1250s, when a Flemish friar named William of Rubruck reached the Mongol heartland and found the Great Khan hosting a formal debate between Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist clergy, each invited to argue their case, with the Khan presiding like a referee who had no intention of ever picking up a ball. A ruler who genuinely cared which doctrine was true does not stage that. A ruler who cares about keeping every kind of subject calm and paying does exactly that. Tolerance wasn't a value they held. It was a cost they had decided not to pay. The obsession with roads and messengers, the passports of gold and iron, not the whims of a conqueror who liked fast horses, but the physical infrastructure of the only product the empire had to sell. Of course, they poured a fortune into roads they could have robbed. The roads were the business. Robbing them would have been robbing themselves. So the drumbeat comes back in a different key. Plunder pays once, safety pays forever. And everything we mistook for the Mongol character turns out to be what that single sentence costs when you take it seriously across a continent. But I have to be honest about the limit of this, or I'm just doing the barbarian story and reverse swapping mindless savages for brilliant economists, which is its own kind of fairy tale. The constraint I've been describing, plunder, is finite. Taxation compounds that constraint was real, and it shaped what was possible. It did not dictate what anyone chose. Plenty of empires faced the exact same arithmetic and never made the turn. They bled their conquests white and collapsed, and the math was sitting right there in front of them the whole time. The Mongols were not fated to become administrators by some iron law of economics. The constraint set the menu. Human beings, with all their appetite and cruelty and calculation, still chose the meal. That distinction is the whole difference between explaining a thing and excusing it. There is a way to test all of this. A natural experiment run for us by history, and it's the reason I keep insisting the product was safety and not silk. If the Mongol contribution to trade had been something physical, a road built, a pass cleared, a harbor dug, then when the empire fell, the physical thing would have remained, and the trade with it. Rome fell, and the roads were still there, carrying traffic for 1,000 years. But watch what actually happens when the Mongol Empire comes apart in the 14th century, fracturing into rival khanates that begin taxing and fighting each other. The mountains do not move. The oases are still where they were. The cities of the route still stand. The workshops still work. The merchants still want, more than anything, to trade. Not one physical fact of the Silk Road has changed, and the trade thins anyway. The great caravans shrink. The route that had blazed for a century dims, and within a few generations the merchants of Europe are pouring their money and their best minds into a desperate, expensive project to reach the East by sea instead, around the whole of Africa, rather than go overland the way their grandfathers did. And there was a crueler turn, still one this whole framework almost predicts. The same connected road that made silk cheap to move made something else cheap to move too, something no tariff could see and no paisa could stop. In the 1340s, a disease came out of the arid heart of Central Asia and traveled the exact corridor the Mongols had secured, riding the fleas on the caravan animals and the rats in the baggage, moving station to station, the way a courier's message once had. It reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa by 1346, and from there it boarded ships. We call it the Black Death. Within a few years, it killed something on the order of 50 million people in Europe alone, and tens of millions more across Asia. The safe road had become the perfect vector. The very achievement, a continent wired together, distance collapsed, was exactly what let a plague do in years, what no army had managed in centuries. There is no clever line for this one. It is simply the bill that connection can carry, and it came due on the Mongols' road first. Why? Because the single thing the Mongols had supplied was the single thing that could not survive them. The road didn't break. It just got expensive again. The 40 warlords came back. The escorts, the bribes, the losses, the whole invisible cost that one empire had crushed down to a single tax came creeping back onto the ledger, ridgeline by ridgeline, until the arithmetic that had made the overland journey worth it quietly stopped working. The Mongols hadn't paved anything. They had been the guarantee. And a guarantee is the one asset that leaves the moment the guarantor does. If this pattern feels oddly familiar, that's because it is. It's not unique to the 13th century. It's the shape of a particular kind of problem, and we're surrounded by modern versions of it. Think about what you're actually paying for when you buy something from a stranger online, and a payment platform sits in the middle of the deal, taking its small cut. You are not paying for the platform to move your money. Moving numbers is nearly free. You are paying it to guarantee the transaction, to make sure the stranger is real, that the thing exists, that if you're defrauded, you're made whole. You are buying safety in a space that would otherwise be too risky to act in at all. The fee is the price of not having to trust the stranger yourself. That is, almost exactly, what a merchant bought with a paisa and a Mongol tariff. Entry into a dangerous space, made safe enough to enter, for a cut. But I have to say where the comparison breaks, because an analogy you can't see the end of is just a trick. A modern payment network earns its trust the opposite way from the Mongols, through neutrality, through code, through the boring promise that it treats everyone the same and will still exist tomorrow. The Mongols earned it through the demonstrated, cataloged willingness to annihilate a city. Same product, a safe space to transact, sold by violence in one case and by dull reliability in the other. The mechanism could hardly be more opposite. Hold both the likeness and the difference at once, because the likeness is what makes the Mongol story legible to us, and the difference is what should stop us from admiring it. So here, finally, is the whole thing in one line. The Mongols did not open the Silk Road. It had been open, on and off, for well over 1,000 years, before a single Mongol rode west. The goods existed, the routes existed, the desire existed. What had always been missing was cheap safety, and for one brutal, extraordinary century, a single empire supplied it, at a scale no one had managed before, and no one would manage again for centuries. They didn't build the road. They lowered the price of its insurance. And it turns out that was enough to light up a continent, and enough, when they were gone, for the dark to come back. Plunder pays once. Safety pays forever, but only for as long as someone can afford to keep the road quiet. The Mongols could. Then they couldn't. And the whole glittering system unwound back into the arithmetic it came from. Which leaves one last thread, and it's the one this whole story was quietly resting on. A tax you collect from 1,000 miles away. A loan you make to a merchant you'll never see again. A tablet of iron that a stranger obeys on faith. None of that works without something we've been taking for granted the entire time. It only works if a promise made in one place can be trusted in another. So the next question is the one underneath this one. What does it cost to make a stranger, a continent away, believe your word is good? That's not a story about armies. That's a story about money and paper and trust, and it's where we're going next.